When it comes to politics, from Washington, D.C. to here in the Lowcountry, Andy Brack knows all about it. I sit down one-on-one with Andy for a special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. And listen later on iHeartRadio. Andy Brack, it's so good to meet you.
Good to see you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, anytime, man. I went back on your Facebook profile just recently, and I looked at your biography, and it reads this: Andy Brack, writer, listener, leader, and dad. Chairman of the Center for a Better South.
Right.
Editor and publisher, obviously, of the famous Statehouse Report. Strategist of the Brack Group. And everyone has been talking to me about this recently, but you were the former press secretary for United States Senator Fritz Hollings.
Yeah.
Obviously, you started studying journalism at UNC Chapel Hill.
Right.
Got your studies filed, psychology, that is, at Duke, and you live here in Charleston.
Yeah, a lot of people say that I'm not loyal to anything because I went to Duke and to North Carolina. But yeah, I've been here pretty much since '88 when I started working at the Post and Courier, and then I went off to Washington to work for Senator Hollings for a few years. Yeah.
Wow. Writer, listener, leader, and dad.
Yeah.
What are you writing? What are you listening to right now?
Well, every week I have a newspaper column. It's published at StatehouseReport.com, but it's also periodically in the City Paper and some other places. Right. A lot of what I've been talking about in the last 2 or 3 years is how South Carolina really doesn't have a plan. I mean, people go up into Columbia to work at the legislature, but they go up with their little pet projects, but there's not anything that's looking at statewide what we need. There's not really, if you're a business person and you want to start a business, the first thing you do is you have a business plan. There's not a plan for South Carolina. It's a lot of little agendas that are going on, and I really think that we need to have Palmetto priorities. We need a 10-point plan, and everybody just needs to start working together on that. The politics in South Carolina is becoming like the politics in Washington, D.C., in that people are at each other all the time. They're not working together, they're working against each other. So I write a lot about poverty and education and health care and environment and things like that, because I think those are illustrative of what's going on in South Carolina.
How do we get here with everyone basically at their throats politically?
I think that people in South Carolina are acting more like what goes on in Washington. And Washington, when I worked for Senator Hollings in the 90s, there was some partisanship, don't get me wrong, but the senators and the representatives were friends outside of the Congress. And things have changed now so that you've got everything at the polls, and people don't talk socially, they just talk in these rancorous hearings and things like that. So I think that the biggest challenge is that people need to be more civil, people need to try to be friends, because I used to say, if you go out and have a drink with somebody, it's really hard to criticize them the next day if you've been out drinking and having a good time. So I think that people just need to be respectful of others a little bit more and stop pushing all this partisan stuff, and try to remember that we're working for the good of the country or the state, not just for petty political individual agendas.
You talk about the country. I know that you and another guy are going to be traveling around the country soon.
We are.
Talk to me more about that.
So I've got a friend named Bruce Hawker, who is the former chief political strategist for the Prime Minister when Labor ran these things in Australia.
Right.
And he's fascinated with American politics and wants to be able to explain to Australians why the midterm elections are going to make a difference. And so I've arranged a trip that we're going to be filming in Arizona, South Carolina, Minnesota, Iowa, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Washington throughout the month of October. And it's just going to be fascinating talking to people. We're going to, if you remember several years ago, there was a shooting in Tucson in which Gabby Giffords was shot. Well, she was replaced by a guy named Ron Barber as congressman, and he was shot during there too. He worked for her. And we're going to talk to him about gun control. We're going to talk to people who think that we shouldn't have any control on guns. We're going to talk about the border policies. In Minnesota, we're going to be talking about trade and agriculture and what's happening to the country. By the time we're going to go to Mike Pence's hometown to talk to and learn more about him. And then in Pennsylvania, which is looking like it might be the place that the House elections are decided, we're going to try to go around with a couple of political candidates and just see what they're hearing and what stuff. But the main thing is just to kind of talk about the spirit of America in this time when the country is fractured more than it ever has been. And let's just see what's out there, because I believe that regular people are a lot closer together than they are apart, and it's the politicians that are driving us apart.
Where is that spirit?
I think you see it in everyday life. You go to church, you go to the grocery store, you see people getting along. I mean, I'm on the library board here.
Right.
We work as a team. I don't know people's political parties because I don't care. I want to make sure that they're working forward for the library, to make sure that we have places of lifelong learning for people. So, you know, I think that there are places around this town and this state where people are engaging in very healthful ways. But when it gets into the politics of it, people start getting divided.
You talk about the library. I want to take you back to last Saturday.
Yeah.
Obviously, you had the 3rd annual Black Aint Festival, African American Book Festival. I was the MC last year.
Yeah.
This year was Tessa, and you had a special guest.
We did. Terry McMillan was
That's
there.
right.
Did you watch her?
No, I was at work.
I tell you what, she one of the things that she did that was hilarious is that she did a couple of readings from her latest book that she's working on. But she walked in and she saw a young man there, and she looked at the fellow's mother and said, "There's some language that we're going to have during this thing. This young man needs to leave the room." And I mean, she was serious, but it was funny too the way that she did it.
Right.
But she read 2 passages, and it probably took about 45 minutes, but it was just entertaining.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is the woman that, you know, when Stella gets her groove back
Right.
and waiting to exhale. I mean,
Right.
she was really outstanding. And I think what's more important is there were probably 300 or 400 people there.
Right, I saw.
And, you know, we had 60 authors, African American authors from around the community there. And what it did, and I really am proud that the library was the convening group along with the library friends,
Oh, yeah.
that it was really just heartening that all these people showed up not only to see her, but to go through and talk to the authors. I mean, you know, when you write and when people listen to you here, it's really just heartening when people say, "Yeah, I saw this. Yeah, I read this." And I think these authors, they need that kind of feedback. So it's good that the library is doing this.
And let me get back to earlier your take on the gun control. I know that
Yeah.
you're going to have a discussion about that around the country.
Yeah.
In South Carolina, where does this discussion go in your mind?
I think there's a lot of education that has to go on in South Carolina. You know, in America, we have so many handguns and so many assault rifles and stuff out there. I think that there should be some reasonable control, some more deeper background checks, and some other things that are on the table at the legislature. They're not moving on it right now, and I think after we had the deaths at Mother Emanuel and some other things, it's time to take a serious look at it instead of just dividing into our partisan positions. And so I really hope that the legislature, through a lot of the leadership of Marlon Kempson and some others, can really start pushing things together to say, what can we do to make our community safer other than getting more police out there, other than putting up wands at high schools, instead of only toughening. I think that we need to do things to make guns harder to get. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that you're going to take guns away from people, but I really think that there needs to be some sanity in the discussion.
And you talk about discussion, still people are talking about the slavery resolution that the city of Charleston passed in June. Where were you emotionally?
I mean, to me, that was a no-brainer. I don't understand why some of these city councilmen voted against it. It just seemed to me that was a gutless vote. So it just seems to me that we've got to do something. If you recall, one of the things that I wrote, and I wrote this mainly after reading about the lynching memorial in Montgomery that opened, I think, late last year. I think that these statues and other things there are representative of history. And I think they should generally remain there. But if they are going to remain there, there needs to be a marker to give context in what it means. So that there needs to be explanatory markers. So that at the Calhoun statue, I think that it's good to have, you know, some language there that explains the context of it. You know, in the city of Charleston, I think that it's great that the city had a resolution on slavery, because the city was the made money off of it. way back when by essentially regulating slavery years and years ago. So I think that we needed to do that apology.
And let me get back to obviously Columbia, because recently, this was written on the Statehouse Report website. Recently on Facebook, it says this: ODD anniversary. It's been 50 years since Richard Nixon's Southern strategy unleashed organized fear to sway an electorate.
Right.
50 years later, where are we with this?
So, you know, just to give context to folks about the Southern strategy, there was a guy that was on Richard Nixon's campaign consulting group named Harry Dent, who's from South Carolina. And he came up with the idea of, let's do what we can by using charged issues to scare white people into voting for Republicans. Because if you remember back in the late 60s, the South was pretty solidly Democratic. It had been for years. And the South had tended to vote in the presidential election for Democratic candidates. That had changed a little bit, but anyway, so they wanted essentially some insurance, and so they started talking about things like busing, school busing, enforced busing, and they started using terms that to white voters meant one thing that it meant to other voters, and it kind of sent the signal of we need to make sure that white voters vote for Republican presidential candidates. And so that was called a Southern strategy, to use the language of fear to make people vote a particular way. And what I'm arguing in this news analysis that was published at Statehouse Report is that it's 50 years since the anniversary of that strategy started. And in a lot of ways, if you look across politics now, it really changed politics. When we were talking earlier about what is it that caused all this division, well, this is part of it. I mean, the politics, the Republicans started using very charged language. The Democrats responded, and, you know, based on the politics of fear. The Democrats responded with similarly charged language, but mainly talking about economics, to try to say, you know, you need to make sure that you vote in your economic interest. And so you've had this rhetoric that's raised over these last 50 years, and I would argue that it's still at work today. So that's kind of what the Southern strategy is. And if you look at the language today, I mean, if you go back, we had President Trump calling one of his top advisors who resigned a dog. Well, as an African-American woman, that's not exactly the kind of language that somebody should be using. You had a guy down in Florida who's the Republican gubernatorial candidate who started talking about monkeying around. You know, that's language that should not be used in political conversations.
And let me get back to your old boss, Fritz Hollings. I know someone recently said this on Facebook, that you wrote a great column about Fritz Hollings and his mastery of humor, that is, in politics.
Yeah.
How did he master that, being a politician?
I think that it goes back to him. Growing up here in Charleston, I mean, Fritz is about 96 years old, and he grew up in the Depression in Charleston, and I think that through the years, just he has engaged people and used humor as a political device. I mean, one of the best stories was back in 1986. He was running for re-election, and his candidate was the candidate running against him was Henry McMaster, who's our governor now. Right. And McMaster's chief of staff reminded me of the story. Okay. And they were in a debate, and McMaster had been a young U.S. attorney in South Carolina. And back in =86, before you were born, I bet. Back in =86,
I was born in '84, so I was like, listening.
You were too. But back in '86, there were the Republicans, Reagan U.S. attorneys made a big deal about drug tests. It was a huge issue of people taking drug tests. And so McMaster, you know, young Republican candidate, challenged Hollings with his silver mane of distinguished hair. He said, you know, he challenged Hollings to a drug test. And Fritz just looked over, and this was in a debate on ETV, looked over and he goes, Henry, I'll be happy to take a drug test just as soon as you can pass an IQ test. And that just became a big joke. Everybody remembered that over the years, and it's just tickled people for years.
And you talk about obviously voting in the primaries and elections that happened in the past. Now, everyone's, including you, are basically saying, hey, it's time for South Carolina to get new voting machines.
Right.
Why now?
Well, I mean, if in a column I recently wrote, The state knows that, let me ask you this. Would you use a 2003 Commodore computer to do your stuff? No. You wouldn't use a computer that's that old. And these machines were built in 2003, 2004.
Okay.
They've just outlived their life. They had a life expectancy of about 15 years.
Okay.
We're there. And so it's time to invest in something new. I think the other thing that's really important is that when you go to the voting booth, there's not a paper trail for your vote. You're just kind of having to trust the computer. And there has been some concern that we need to have a paper trail in case we need to have some sort of recount, that's done by looking at what people's intent to vote was. So, basically, the Election Commission knows it needs somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 million to buy new election voting machines. They've set aside 15, so we've got about 35 million that needs to be there. There is going to be more than likely the feds are going to say next year that you have to have these voting machines in place by the presidential primary. And remember, we're one of the first presidential primary states, so that means we have to have them in place by about February of 2020. It takes a year to do this. So we need to really make sure that the legislature puts that money up right away so that we can get those machines underway.
And let me get back to Governor McMaster.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's in the race for governor between
Right.
him and James Smith, the Democratic nominee. What are you writing about this?
I'm not writing that much about it right now. I've written some about it, but I think that when it comes closer to the election,
Okay.
I'll probably endorse one of the two. Governor McMaster has done a pretty good job, I think. We're in the middle right now here in September 10 of a hurricane bearing down upon us. He's been tested on those things, and he's done pretty well of getting the state together on that. I don't like some of the ways that he's not working on education as much as I want him to. And I think that James Smith has a different style of leadership that might be more inclusive. But we'll have to see where I go on that.
And let me get back to your Facebook profile and obviously your biography. It reads this: Andy Brack, writer, listener, leader, and dad.
Right.
What are you going to be writing next? And what will you listen to next?
That's actually, I can answer that in a couple of ways. I'm asking people this week, what would the questions be that you ask State House candidates? Because we're getting to the point that a lot of people are saying, okay, do I vote for the Republican or the Democrat? And it seems to me that they ought to have a list of questions that they could ask. And so what I'm really doing this week is I'm going around asking the people, what do you want to hear from a political candidate right now at the State House level? I think the other things that we're doing is just trying to understand what's going on in America. So I would imagine that when I'm in Arizona or Minnesota or Pennsylvania, rather than write about South Carolina stuff, those weeks I'm probably going to write about what's going on here and try to relate it back to South Carolina.
Andy Brack, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I really, really appreciate this.
Thank you so much.